Welcome to the Cathedral of Ancient Light, a sanctuary for the mind where history is not a test but a tapestry, woven from threads of ambition, strategy, and destiny, all recounted in a gentle cadence to soothe your spirit. Tonight, we dim the modern world and cast our gaze back over 2,000 years, to a time when the calm blue waters of the Mediterranean Sea were not a symbol of peace, but a stage for an epic struggle between two brilliant civilizations. We begin our journey not with the clamor of battle, but with the quiet tension of a rising dawn in the 3rd century before the Common Era, a world of marble temples, fertile farmlands, and bustling ports powered by wind and oar. Picture the disciplined agrarian society of the Roman Republic, its heart beating in the hills of central Italy, a community bound by law, duty, and an unyielding drive to secure its borders and its future. Now, let your mind drift south across the sea to the ancient, cosmopolitan harbor of Carthage, a glittering jewel of trade and wealth founded by Phoenician merchants from the east, a city whose power flowed from its vast commercial network and its mastery of the open waves. Here in the Cathedral of Ancient Light, we find these two powers, so different in their character and dreams, slowly turning their attention toward the same strategic prize, the fertile, sun-drenched island of Sicily, a land that sat like a stepping stone between their separate worlds. For generations, their spheres of influence had brushed against one another with a wary respect, a balance maintained by distance and differing pursuits, until a single spark of local conflict in the city of Messana would ignite a fire that would burn for over a century. This is not merely a story of war, but a profound transformation, a saga where legends were born, empires were forged in desperation, and the very destiny of the Western world was irrevocably set on a new course. So find a comfortable rest, release the weight of the present, and allow the slow, resonant echoes of this ancient rivalry to guide you toward a state of deep, reflective calm as we prepare to witness the first act of the Great Punic Wars. Chapter 1: The Spark in Sicily, 264 BCE. Let us drift back to a world of marble and olive groves, to the island of Sicily, where the spark for our great story was struck not by kings or consuls, but by mercenaries. A band of Italian warriors known as the Mamertines had seized the strategic port city of Messana, living as brigands and ruling with a heavy hand for over a generation. Their reign was threatened when the scholarly and capable Greek king of Syracuse, Hiero II, finally marched to crush this nest of pirates, besieging the city with a formidable and righteous army. Facing annihilation, the Mamertines fractured, with one faction sending a plea to Carthage for protection and another, distrustful of Carthaginian dominance, sending a secret envoy across the straits to Rome. The Roman Senate, comfortable in its land-based power, was deeply divided, weighing the dishonor of aiding such lawless men against a terrifying strategic prospect. Older senators, like the respected Appius Claudius Caudex, initially saw no benefit in a distant war, while younger, ambitious voices envisioned Carthaginian control of the strait-choking Roman trade. The debate moved to the popular assembly, where tales of potential glory and the clear danger of a Carthaginian, Sicily swayed the citizens to vote for intervention. Thus, the consul Appius Claudius Caudex was dispatched with an army, setting in motion a conflict far greater than anyone could have foreseen on that fateful day. The Carthaginians, ever pragmatic masters of Mediterranean realpolitik, had already acted, placing a small garrison in Messana's citadel to stabilize the situation and secure their influence. This move, logical from their perspective, was seen in Rome as a hostile act, a deliberate barrier to their own newly promised protection of the Mamertines. When Consul Claudius attempted a diplomatic crossing to Messana, his transports were met and boldly blocked by a combined fleet of Carthaginian and Syracusan warships, their hulls gleaming in the sun. Undeterred, the Roman commander used the cover of night and a brewing storm to slip his infantry across the dangerous strait, achieving a risky but successful landing on Sicilian soil. He then entered Messana, and through a combination of threat and negotiation, convinced the hesitant Carthaginian commander Hanno to withdraw his garrison from the city peacefully. This initial Roman success, however, had the effect of solidifying the alliance between Carthage and Syracuse, uniting them firmly against the new Italian interlopers in a bond of shared opposition. The war's first major clash moved south to the rich Greek city of Agrigentum, where a significant Carthaginian army under Hannibal Barca was gathered to make a stand. The Romans, demonstrating their now famous siegecraft, surrounded the city and endured a grueling months-long blockade that tested the stamina of both armies to its absolute limit. The siege of Agrigentum became a grim contest of attrition, with supply lines cut and hunger stalking both the defenders within the walls and the besiegers in their trenches. The Carthaginian general Hanno, son of Hannibal, eventually arrived with a relief force, setting up a separate camp and attempting to pinch the Roman army between his troops and the city's garrison. A complex series of skirmishes and cavalry clashes ensued, with the Romans managing to hold their dual front through disciplined formation and sheer stubbornness. The critical moment came when supplies in Agrigentum finally failed, forcing the Carthaginian garrison to attempt a desperate breakout under the cover of darkness. In the confused and bloody fighting that followed in the narrow space between the city walls and the Roman lines, the legions prevailed, slaughtering many of the escaping soldiers and civilians. The city fell, and the Romans seized great plunder, but their behavior in sacking Agrigentum alienated many Sicilian Greek cities they had hoped to win over. This early victory revealed the Roman legion's power on land, but also highlighted a fundamental, glaring weakness. They could not challenge Carthage where its power truly resided. To truly contest this war beyond Sicily's coast, Rome would need to confront the Carthaginian navy, a force that had ruled the central Mediterranean waves unchallenged for centuries, and so they made a monumental decision. That decision was to build a fleet, a task for which the agrarian republic had no natural affinity, no great store of shipwrights, and no deep tradition of naval warfare. Their process was one of breathtaking imitation and innovation, beginning with the careful study of a Carthaginian quinquereme that had run aground and been captured intact. Roman craftsmen used this wreck as a literal blueprint, replicating its design while adding their own critical, pragmatic modifications suited to their strengths. The most famous of these was the corvus, or raven, a boarding bridge with a heavy iron spike that could be dropped onto an enemy deck, turning a naval battle into a platform for legionaries. Within an astonishing 60 days, the forests of Italy were felled to produce a fleet of 100 quinqueremes and 20 triremes, a testament to relentless organization. Thousands of raw recruits, farmers and infantrymen, were drilled on wooden benches on land, learning to pull as one before ever feeling the swell of the sea beneath them. This Herculean effort was a colossal gamble, risking the Republic's treasury and manpower on a single throw of the dice in an unfamiliar element. The new fleet, under the command of Consul Gaius Duilius, sailed south in 260 BCE, its mission to break Carthage's maritime dominance and change the very nature of the war. The two fleets met off the northern coast of Sicily near Mylae, the Carthaginians commanded by Hannibal Barca, who viewed the novice Roman sailors with open and fatal contempt. Confident in their superior seamanship, the Carthaginian captains maneuvered to ram the clumsy Roman vessels, expecting to easily puncture their hulls and send them to the deep. As they closed, however, the Roman corvée swung down with a thunderous crash, the iron spikes digging deep into the enemy decks, locking the ships together. Across these bridges stormed Rome's disciplined legionaries, turning the fluid naval engagement into a series of isolated infantry battles on unstable wooden platforms. The Carthaginians were utterly confounded, their skill with ship handling was nullified, and their marines were no match for Roman heavy infantry in close combat. Ship after ship was captured in this manner, and the remainder of the Carthaginian fleet broke off in disarray and retreat, fleeing the scene of their shocking defeat. Consul Duilius had secured Rome's first major naval victory, a triumph that resonated through the Republic and was commemorated with a grand column in the Forum. The Battle of Mylae proved Rome could not only challenge Carthage at sea, but could impose its own brutal, innovative logic upon the waves, a lesson that would echo through the coming decades of struggle. Chapter 2: Duilius and the Raven, 260 BCE. The confidence that bloomed in Rome after Mylae was like a sudden, warm wind, filling the sails of public ambition and pushing the Senate's strategy toward more aggressive shores. Emboldened, they envisioned striking not at Carthage's outstretched fingers in Sicily, but directly at its heart in North Africa, hoping to bring the war to a swift and decisive end. A major fleet and army were assembled under the command of the consuls for 256 BCE, Marcus Atilius Regulus and Lucius Manlius Vulso Longus, a force of over 330 ships carrying some 40,000 men. This immense armada, a testament to Rome's now formidable naval capacity, sailed south along the Sicilian coast, its destination the open sea and the African coast beyond. The Carthaginian fleet, determined to defend the homeland, intercepted them near Cape Ecnomus in what would become one of the largest naval battles in all of ancient history. The Roman fleet adopted a novel wedge-shaped formation, with the consuls' ships at the tip and the horse transports in a protected rear, while the Carthaginians planned to use their agility to break the Roman line. What followed was a chaotic, sprawling melee across the bright summer water, with hundreds of thousands of oars churning the sea into froth and the air filling with the shouts of sailors and the crash of corvée. At Ecnomus, the Carthaginian plan to isolate and destroy the Roman rear was initially successful, creating a furious battle on multiple separate fronts across the vast battlefield of the sea. The Roman consuls in the lead wedge, however, drove fiercely through the center of the Carthaginian line, disrupting their coordination and forcing a general engagement on Roman terms. Once again, the deadly corvi found their marks, and legionaries swarmed across onto Carthaginian decks, claiming ship after ship in brutal hand-to-hand combat. After a long day of fighting, the Carthaginian fleet was shattered, losing nearly 100 ships to capture or sinking, while Roman losses were comparatively light. This stunning victory cleared the path to Africa, and the Roman army landed shortly thereafter near the wealthy city of Aspes, which they quickly captured and fortified as their beachhead. The consuls then received orders that Vulso would return to Rome with much of the fleet and captured spoils, while Regulus would remain with a reduced force of 15,000 infantry and 500 cavalry to campaign in Africa. It was a moment of supreme Roman confidence, a belief that a single consul with a modest army could humble the great empire of Carthage on its own soil, a belief that would soon be tested by harsh reality. Consul Regulus began his African campaign with spectacular success, marching his legions through the fertile countryside, ravaging estates and capturing towns with little organized resistance. The terrified Carthaginian government, its citizen army seemingly no match for the legions in open battle, sent frantic envoys to sue for peace, hoping to avoid a siege of their mighty city. Regulus, flush with victory and perhaps overconfident, demanded terms so severe they were impossible to accept. Carthage would surrender Sicily, Sardinia and its navy, become a Roman client, and pay a massive indemnity. Faced with such an ultimatum, the Carthaginians resolved to fight on, and in their desperation, they turned to a professional soldier of fortune, a Spartan mercenary general named Xanthippus. Xanthippus immediately recognized the weaknesses of the Carthaginian citizen militia and the strengths of the Roman legions, and he set about drilling the army with rigorous Spartan discipline. He reorganized the forces, placing greater emphasis on the Carthaginian war elephants and its superior Numidian cavalry, elements the Romans had thus far not faced in great number. In the spring of 255 BCE, Xanthippus led the revitalized Carthaginian army out to meet Regulus on the open plain near Tunis, deliberately choosing flat terrain to maximize the effect of his cavalry and elephants. The Battle of Bagrada's River, also called the Battle of Tunis, was a masterpiece of tactical reversal, where Xanthippus perfectly countered the rigid Roman formation. He placed his war elephants in a line at the front to disrupt the Roman infantry advance, a terrifying and novel sight for Regulus's men, followed by his disciplined Carthaginian phalanx. On the flanks, he stationed his swift Numidian cavalry, the finest light horsemen in the world, with orders to outmaneuver and crush the small, outclassed Roman cavalry. As the battle commenced, the Roman legions were immediately thrown into chaos by the elephant charge, their compact formations breaking as men tried to avoid the trampling beasts. The Numidian cavalry made short work of their Roman counterparts and then swept around to attack the legions from the rear and flanks, completing the encirclement. Regulus's army was annihilated. Only a small remnant, perhaps 2,000 men, managed to fight its way back to the safety of Aspes, while the consul himself was captured and taken to Carthage in chains. The defeat was total and catastrophic, wiping out the gains of the entire African expedition, and proving that Rome could not yet easily conquer Carthage on its home ground. The disaster left the remaining Roman garrison in Aspes isolated and vulnerable, prompting an immediate and massive rescue effort from Sicily that would lead to a new kind of calamity. The Roman Senate, upon hearing of Regulus's defeat, acted with its characteristic resolve, ordering a new fleet to be assembled with all possible speed to evacuate the survivors from Aspes. This relief fleet, commanded by the consuls Servius Fulvius Paetinus Nobilia and Marcus Aemilius Paulus, successfully reached Africa, embarked the soldiers, and turned back for Sicily. As they sailed along the southern coast of Sicily in the autumn of 255 BCE, they were caught by a sudden and violent Mediterranean storm, a tempest of legendary fury. The heavy, unseaworthy Roman ships, overloaded with men and equipment, were helpless against the towering waves and shrieking winds that drove them onto the rocky shoreline. The catastrophe was near total. Of the 364 ships that had set out, only 80 survived, with an estimated 100,000 men, mostly rowers from the lower classes of Roman society, perishing in the waves. It was one of the worst maritime disasters in human history, a loss so staggering it would have broken the spirit of almost any other state, wiping out the naval advantage won at Ecnomus. Yet in a display of almost incomprehensible determination, the Roman Senate and people voted to rebuild the fleet once more, demonstrating a will to endure that would become the defining feature of this long war. The focus of the conflict now settled back onto the rugged landscape of Sicily, where the war would grind on for years in a series of sieges and skirmishes, a costly stalemate under the island's relentless sun. Chapter 3: The Hammer of the Sea, 249 BCE. The war in Sicily settled into a grueling, expensive stalemate, a war of attrition fought over fortified hill towns and harbors, draining the treasuries and spirits of both mighty empires. The key to breaking this deadlock, both sides believed, lay with the great Carthaginian-held fortress port of Lilybaeum on Sicily's western tip, a city with formidable walls and a direct lifeline to Carthage. In 249 BCE, the Roman consul Publius Claudius Pulcher, a man of arrogant and impetuous character, decided to launch a surprise naval assault on the Carthaginian fleet sheltering in the nearby harbour of Drepana. Ignoring unfavourable religious omens, famously throwing the sacred chickens that refused to eat overboard, Claudius led his fleet by night in a daring attempt to sneak into the enemy harbour at dawn. The Carthaginian commander Adherbal, however, was alert and reacted with brilliant speed, ordering his ships to row out of the harbour's southern entrance to meet the Romans in the open sea. This manoeuvre caught the Roman fleet in a state of confusion, trapped against the shoreline with its backs to the coast and no room to deploy their corvée effectively. The Battle of Drepana became a classic demonstration of superior Carthaginian seamanship, as their agile ships rammed and sank the cumbersome Roman vessels one after another. Claudius escaped with about 30 ships, but the Romans lost over 90, a devastating defeat that handed naval supremacy back to Carthage and shattered Roman confidence on the waves. The disaster at Drepana was compounded by a further act of divine wrath, or perhaps simple meteorological misfortune, that befell the other Roman consul, Lucius Junius Pullus. Pullus was in command of a massive supply convoy, hundreds of merchant vessels laden with grain and equipment for the army besieging Lilybaeum, escorted by a fleet of 120 warships. As this immense but vulnerable convoy rounded the southern coast of Sicily, it was struck by the same treacherous weather patterns that had destroyed the fleet years before, a sudden and violent tempest. The storm swept the entire convoy onto the rocky shores near Camarina, smashing ships into splinters and scattering priceless cargo across the sea and sand. Not a single vessel from the supply fleet or its escort survived this second catastrophic storm, a loss that seemed to signal the gods themselves were turning against the Roman cause. With the fleet annihilated at Drepana and the supply fleet destroyed by storm, Carthage now commanded the seas around Sicily, resupplying Lilybaeum and Drepana at will and launching raids on the Italian coast. Rome, financially and emotionally exhausted, could not immediately rebuild. For nearly 7 years, they abandoned large-scale naval warfare, fighting a defensive land war in Sicily while pirates and Carthaginian squadrons prowled their shores. This period marked the nadir of Roman fortunes, a time when the great effort of the war seemed for naught, and the strategy of frontal assault appeared to have reached its grim, costly limit. The man who gradually steered Rome out of this despair was not a flamboyant consul, but a patient, calculating aristocrat named Gaius Aurelius Cotta, who understood the war's new economic and psychological reality. He and other pragmatic senators realized that without a fleet, Rome could not win, but building a new one required a colossal financial sacrifice from the Republic's wealthiest citizens. In a remarkable display of public spirit and patriotism, the leading senators and equestrians stepped forward, agreeing to fund the construction of a new fleet from their own private fortunes, without immediate state repayment. This act of collective will breathed new life into the war effort, and by 242 BCE, a new fleet of 200 quinqueremes, built with private money, was ready at the docks of Ostia. The man given command was a consul of quiet competence, Gaius Lutatius Catulus, who understood the lessons of past failures and implemented critical reforms. He had the new ships built lighter and faster for better handling, and he drilled his rowers and marines relentlessly, focusing on speed and maneuver over the now abandoned corvus. His strategy was shrewdly limited. Instead of seeking a grand, decisive battle, he would blockade the key Carthaginian ports in Sicily, strangling their armies of supply and forcing a final confrontation on his terms. Catulus and his dedicated fleet sailed for Sicily, silently and efficiently sealing off the harbours of Lilybaeum and Drepana, setting a trap that Carthage, complacent in its naval dominance, was slow to recognize. The Carthaginian government, finally alerted to the grave danger of the new Roman blockade, scrambled to assemble a relief fleet, loading it not with seasoned marines but with vital supplies, grain, dried meat and equipment for their starving troops in Sicily. This fleet, commanded by Hanno, arrived at the Aegates Islands, just west of Drepana, in March of 241 BCE, a time of year known for its unpredictable and rough seas. Catulus, despite suffering from a wound, seized the opportunity. His lighter, well-drilled ships met Hanno's heavier, supply-laden vessels as they attempted to run the blockade in choppy weather. The Battle of the Aegates Islands was not a clash of intricate tactics, but a brutal demonstration of superior readiness and seamanship, with the Roman ships outmaneuvering and ramming the burdened Carthaginian transports. Hanno's fleet was utterly crushed, with 50 ships sunk and 70 captured, along with their priceless cargo, a loss from which Carthage could not recover. With their last fleet destroyed and their armies in Sicily cut off and starving, the Carthaginian government had no choice but to sue for peace, sending orders to their general Hamilcar Barca to negotiate terms. The war that had begun with mercenaries in Messana 23 years earlier now ended with a fleet in flames off rocky islands, a testament to Roman endurance and the final, crushing weight of sea power. The peace treaty negotiated by Catullus and Hamilcar Barca was harsh but not annihilating, designed to cripple Carthage as a rival while ending the immediate conflict. Carthage was forced to evacuate all of Sicily, forever relinquishing its long-held dominion over the island, which would now become Rome's first overseas province. They had to surrender all prisoners of war without ransom and pay a massive indemnity of 3,200 talents of silver, 200 payable immediately and 1,000 over 10 years, a staggering financial burden. Crucially, Carthage was forbidden from making war on Syracuse or its allies, effectively locking it out of Sicilian affairs and curtailing its freedom of action in the central Mediterranean. Rome, for its part, demanded no territory in Africa and placed no restrictions on Carthage's rule there, a sign that they sought security, not total destruction at this time. The Roman people, weary of the long struggle, ratified the treaty, and Hamilcar Barca, in a proud and bitter ceremony, led his unbeaten army out of its mountain stronghold and laid down its arms. The First Punic War was over, a victory won not by a single brilliant general, but by the relentless, grinding will of the Roman state and its citizens to outbuild, outsuffer, and outlast its adversary. Yet, as Hamilcar and his officers sailed for Africa, a seed of lasting hatred was planted, a resentment that would be nurtured by the next generation, ensuring the peace was only a fragile intermission, not a final curtain. Chapter 4: The Lion's Brood, 237 to 18 BCE. The peace that settled over the Mediterranean was shallow and uneasy, for while Rome turned to consolidating its new province of Sicily, a storm of a different kind was brewing in Carthage. The returning mercenary armies, unpaid and simmering with discontent over their long service, erupted into a brutal and savage conflict known as the Mercenary War, which threatened to destroy Carthage from within. Hamilcar Barca, the undefeated general from Sicily, was given command, and through ruthless genius and sheer force of will, crushed the rebellion after 3 terrible years, but the struggle bled Carthage white. During this crisis, Rome seized the island of Sardinia, cynically exploiting Carthage's weakness despite the treaty, an act of such bold aggression it was seared into the Carthaginian soul as a lasting betrayal. Hamilcar, his hatred for Rome now a burning creed, looked west to the Iberian Peninsula, a land of untapped mineral wealth and fierce warrior tribes, as a new base for power and future vengeance. With his young son Hannibal at his side, he is said to have made the boy swear an eternal oath of enmity against Rome, a foundational myth for the legend to come, before departing for Hispania. There, through 8 years of relentless campaigning and diplomacy, Hamilcar carved out a new Carthaginian empire, extracting silver to refill the treasury and building a powerful, personally loyal army before his death in battle. The work of empire building in Hispania was continued by Hamilcar's son-in-law, the shrewd and diplomatic Hasdrubal the Fair, who consolidated the territorial gains and founded the magnificent coastal city of New Carthage as its capital. Hasdrubal preferred treaties and marriages with local chieftains to constant war, skillfully expanding Carthaginian influence while avoiding provoking Rome's direct attention. His success, however, did draw the gaze of the Roman Senate, which sent envoys to negotiate a formal boundary, resulting in the Ebro Treaty of 226 BCE. This agreement stipulated that Carthage would not expand its influence north of the Ebro River, a line that, for a time, maintained an uneasy peace between the two powers in the western Mediterranean. Hasdrubal's rule was cut short by an assassin in 221 BCE, and the army, exercising its right to choose its leader, unanimously acclaimed the 25-year-old Hannibal Barca as their new commander-in-chief. Hannibal, raised in the camp, trained for war and steeped in his father's hatred, was immediately accepted, his charismatic authority and proven courage in earlier campaigns winning the fierce loyalty of his veterans. He spent 2 years completing the subjugation of tribes south of the Ebro, securing his base and resources, his eyes always looking beyond the Iberian mountains, toward the passes of the Alps and the plains of Italy, where he believed Rome could truly be broken. The spark for the Second Punic War came from a town south of the Ebro, but within a sphere of influence Rome considered its own, the wealthy city of Saguntum. Saguntum, fearing Hannibal's growing power, had forged an alliance with Rome, and its internal politics became a proxy struggle between Roman and Carthaginian factions. Hannibal, testing Roman resolve, laid siege to the city in 219 BCE, a deliberate challenge to the Roman protectorate that lasted 8 grueling months before the city fell. The Roman Senate, outraged, sent an ultimatum to Carthage demanding Hannibal be handed over for punishment, a demand the revitalized and proud Carthaginian government, led by the Barcid faction, flatly refused. The Roman ambassador, Quintus Fabius Maximus, is said to have held up the folds of his toga and declared, "Here I carry peace and war, choose which you will have." The Carthaginian council replied, "Give us whichever you wish." Fabius let the folds fall and said, "Then I give you war," to which the Carthaginians shouted, "We accept it." Thus, in the spring of 218 BCE, Hannibal, having planned for this moment for years, mobilized his grand army of nearly 90,000 infantry, 12,000 cavalry, and 37 war elephants, and marched north from New Carthage, beginning one of the most audacious military campaigns in history. Hannibal's first obstacle was the Pyrenees, mountains he crossed with relative ease, though not without cost, as he left a sizable garrison to secure his rear and saw some desertions among troops reluctant to leave Hispania. His greater challenge was the broad, rushing current of the Rhone River in southern Gaul, where a large force of local Volcae tribesmen awaited him on the far bank. With brilliant deception, Hannibal sent a detachment upstream to cross at night and attack the Gauls from behind, while his main force built rafts for a frontal assault at dawn, scattering the defenders. It was here he learned that a Roman consular army under Publius Cornelius Scipio had already landed at Massilia, blocking the coastal route into Italy. Undeterred, Hannibal turned his columns inland, toward the towering, snow-dusted barrier of the Alps. The crossing in the early autumn of 218 BCE was an epic of suffering and military will, a fight not against Romans but against geography, climate, and hostile mountain tribes. His army, stretched along narrow, treacherous paths, was harassed by Gallic ambushes from the heights, and men and animals slipped to their deaths in the icy ravines, the air thin and cold. After 15 days of supreme exertion, Hannibal led the ragged remnants of his force, some 20,000 infantry, 6,000 cavalry, and a handful of surviving elephants, down into the green, welcoming plains of the Po Valley, achieving the impossible. The descent from the Alps was a moment of profound psychological triumph, but the army was exhausted, half-starved, and in dire need of rest and resupply. The Cisalpine Gauls of northern Italy, recently conquered by Rome and simmering with resentment, viewed Hannibal not as an invader but as a liberator, flocking to his standard with men and supplies. This infusion of Gallic warriors restored his numbers and provided a secure base from which to operate, fulfilling a key part of his strategic plan to turn Rome's subjects against her. The first test came quickly, as the Roman consul Scipio, having sailed back from Massalia, confronted him near the Ticinus River with a force of cavalry and light infantry. In this initial cavalry skirmish, Hannibal's superb Numidian horsemen easily routed the Romans, and Scipio himself was severely wounded, saved only by the bravery of his young son, also named Publius Cornelius Scipio. This minor victory further encouraged the Gauls and demonstrated the qualitative superiority of Carthaginian cavalry, a theme that would haunt Rome for years. Hannibal then maneuvered to meet the combined Roman armies of the wounded Scipio and the other consul, Tiberius Sempronius Longus, who had been recalled from Sicily, on the open ground near the Trebia River. Using the terrain and the bitter winter weather to his advantage, Hannibal laid a perfect trap, concealing a force under his brother Mago in the brush of a streambed, setting the stage for the first great disaster to befall the legions. Chapter 5: The Trap at Trebia, 218 BCE. The stage for the Battle of the Trebia was a cold, waterlogged plain in December of 218 BCE, with the river running high and a biting sleet beginning to fall from a leaden sky. Consul Sempronius Longus, aggressive and eager for personal glory before his term ended, was goaded by Hannibal's light cavalry into a rash pursuit across the freezing river. The Roman legions, numb and soaked from wadding chest-deep through the icy current, emerged on the far bank in disarray, their bodies chilled and their formations loose, their energy already sapped. Hannibal's army, by contrast, had breakfasted by warm fires, their bodies rubbed with oil for insulation, and they waited in disciplined, dry ranks for the shivering Romans to advance. As the main lines of heavy infantry clashed in the center, with the Carthaginian phalanx deliberately giving ground to draw the Romans in, the critical flanking elements of Hannibal's plans swung into motion. His superior cavalry, both Numidian and Iberian, drove off the Roman horse on both wings, leaving the legionary flanks exposed and vulnerable to the next, terrifying phase of the trap. From concealment in a watercourse to the Roman rear, Mago Barca and his elite Carthaginian and Celtic infantry sprang their ambush, falling upon the Roman back ranks with a savage war cry. The shock of Mago's surprise attack from behind, combined with the pressure from the front and the sleet stinging their faces, shattered Roman morale completely, turning an orderly battle into a bloody rout. The center of the Roman army, some 10,000 of the fittest men, managed to hold their formation and fought their way brutally through the Carthaginian center, escaping south to the fortified town of Placentia. The rest of the consular army was not so fortunate. Trapped and surrounded, they were cut down by the thousands or drowned trying to recross the treacherous, swollen river in their panic. The Carthaginian victory was total, demonstrating Hannibal's masterful use of terrain, weather, psychology, and combined arms to defeat a numerically superior Roman force on its own soil. This triumph solidified Hannibal's reputation as an invincible general among the Gallic tribes, who now poured in even greater numbers to join his cause, swelling his ranks for the campaigns to come. The Romans, reeling from the defeat, abandoned the Po Valley north of the Apennines to Hannibal, who wintered his army comfortably among his new Gallic allies, planning his next move. As the snows melted in the spring of 217 BCE, Hannibal made another daring decision. Instead of marching on Rome directly, he would cross the Apennines and the treacherous Arno marshes, striking into central Italy to provoke further defections and isolate the Republic from its allies. The march through the Arno marshes in the early spring floods was another ordeal of almost unimaginable suffering, 4 days and 3 nights of wadding through putrid, chest-high water with no dry ground for rest. Hannibal himself rode his last surviving elephant, but an infection set into an old eye wound, and lacking proper treatment in the swamp, he lost the sight in one eye, becoming Hannibal the One-Eyed. The army emerged from this hellscape exhausted, but they had achieved strategic surprise, placing themselves between Rome and the army of the new consul, Gaius Flaminius, who was guarding the more obvious eastern route at Ariminum. Flaminius, a populist and impatient man, took the bait when Hannibal began to ravage the rich Etruscan countryside, a direct insult to the consul's authority and a threat to his political standing. Against the advice of his officers, who urged caution and to wait for his fellow consul's army, Flaminius broke camp and pursued Hannibal's army with hurried marches, his anger clouding his judgment. Hannibal, with perfect theatrical instinct, chose his next battleground with care, the northern shore of Lake Trasimene, where a narrow road ran between the water's edge and a line of wooded hills. There, in the thick morning mist that rose from the lake, he concealed his entire army in the hills and along the road, waiting for the Roman column to enter the natural killing ground, a snare of fog and steel. Chapter 6: The Mist of Trasimene, 217 BCE. On the morning of June 21, 217 BCE, a dense, persistent mist clung to the surface of Lake Trasimene, limiting visibility to a few feet and muffling all sound in a ghostly, damp blanket. Consul Flaminius, driven by fury and the visible plumes of smoke from Hannibal's foraging parties, pushed his army of roughly 30,000 men in a hurried narrow column along the lakeside road, seeking a fight. He had sent out no proper scouting ahead, believing the Carthaginian army was somewhere ahead on the road, not realizing it was stacked in silence on the slopes to his right. As the entire Roman column entered the defile between the hills and the water, the trap was sprung not with a trumpet call, but with a sudden, terrifying cacophony of shouts and war cries from all sides at once. The Carthaginians charged down the slopes into the flank and rear of the stunned Roman column, which had no room to deploy into its battle lines, the mist making command and coordination impossible. The battle immediately dissolved into a series of desperate, isolated massacres as Roman soldiers, disoriented and trapped against the lake, were cut down where they stood or driven into the deep water to drown under the weight of their armor. The fighting was brutal and brief, a 3-hour slaughter more than a battle, with the mist only lifting toward the end to reveal the full, horrifying scale of the Roman catastrophe. Flaminius himself, fighting bravely, was killed by a Celtic spear thrust. His body was never recovered, lost in the chaotic melee and the waters of the lake. Of the 30,000 Romans, roughly 15,000 perished on the shore or in the lake, and most of the remainder were captured. Only the vanguard of about 6,000 men managed to cut their way out and escape to a nearby hilltop. These survivors surrendered the next day when Hannibal's cavalry surrounded them, adding to the immense haul of prisoners, adding a final, crushing note to the victory. In a single morning, a complete consular army had been annihilated, and the road to Rome itself, now virtually undefended, lay open to Hannibal and his victorious, confident army. The news, when it reached Rome days later, triggered sheer panic. The praetor had to famously announce to the crowds, "We have been defeated in a great battle," and the city prepared for a siege that never came. For Hannibal, ever the grand strategist, knew his army lacked the siege equipment to take a city like Rome, and his goal remained to break the Italian alliance system, not to storm the capital directly. In the terrified vacuum of leadership that followed Trasimene, the Roman Republic turned to a constitutional expedient, the appointment of a dictator, a single commander with supreme power for 6 months. The man chosen was the seasoned, deliberate, and deeply conservative aristocrat Quintus Fabius Maximus, who would earn the nickname Cunctator, the Delayer. Fabius understood with perfect clarity that he could not defeat Hannibal in a pitched battle, the Carthaginian's tactical genius and superior cavalry made that a suicidal gamble. His strategy, therefore, was one of relentless defensive shadowing. His army would follow Hannibal's movements, staying on high ground, harassing foraging parties, and denying him a decisive engagement. This Fabian strategy was deeply unpopular with a Roman populace and soldiery raised on the ethos of direct, honorable confrontation, who saw it as cowardly and shameful. As Hannibal marched unopposed through the richest lands of Italy, burning and looting to prove Roman impotence, Fabius dogged his steps, a frustrating, cautious shadow that prevented any more catastrophic defeats. The climax of this tense dance came in the Falernian plain, where Fabius used the terrain to trap Hannibal's army in a valley, only to have the Carthaginian escape at night by a famous ruse, driving cattle with torches tied to their horns up a mountain pass as a diversion. Fabius's masterstroke had slipped away, and his 6-month dictatorship ended with public frustration mounting, setting the stage for a return to the old, aggressive ways that Hannibal so desperately desired. Chapter 7: The Dusk at Cannae, 216 BCE. The year 216 BCE dawned with a furious Roman desire for vengeance, and a decisive end to the Hannibalic nightmare that had ravaged Italy for 2 years. The Senate raised an unprecedented army of 8 legions, nearly 80,000 Roman and allied infantry and 6,000 cavalry, and placed it under the joint command of the 2 consuls, the patrician Lucius Aemilius Paulus and the plebeian Gaius Terentius Varro. The command rotated daily between the 2 men, a flawed system that played directly into Hannibal's hands, as Paulus advocated caution while the populist Varro hungered for a fight to resolve the war. In late July, the massive Roman army found Hannibal's force of roughly 50,000, camped near the small Apulian town of Cannae, which controlled vital grain stores. Varro, on his day of command, forced the issue and led the army onto a wide, open plain ideal for cavalry. Hannibal, outnumbered in infantry but confident in his superb cavalry, arranged his army in a deliberate convex crescent formation, with his weaker Gallic and Iberian infantry in the center and his veteran African infantry on the hard flanks. He placed his cavalry, under Hasdrubal, not his brother, and Hanno, on the wings with explicit orders to crush the Roman horse quickly and then attack the rear of the legions, a plan of beautiful, lethal simplicity. On the morning of August 2, the 2 colossal armies faced each other under the blazing Apulian sun, the Romans in their deeper, more compact traditional formation designed for sheer pushing power. As the lines advanced and met, the Carthaginian center, as Hannibal had planned, began to slowly give ground under the immense pressure of the Roman mass, bending the crescent inward from a bulge to a line, then to a concave pocket. The Roman commanders, seeing the enemy center apparently collapsing, ordered a deeper push, compressing their own vast numbers forward into the ever-tightening space, their formation losing all cohesion and mobility. At this critical moment, the Carthaginian cavalry completed its work on the flanks, utterly annihilating the outmatched Roman and allied horse, and then, as ordered, wheeled to charge into the back of the now encircled Roman infantry. Simultaneously, Hannibal's veteran African infantry, stationed on the ends of the original crescent, wheeled inward like 2 great doors slamming shut, striking the packed Roman flanks. What followed was not a battle, but a systematic massacre, one of the most tactically perfect annihilations in military history, as the Roman army was completely enveloped in a killing zone with no avenue of escape. The tightly packed Romans could not raise their arms to wield their weapons effectively. Men in the center suffocated, or were trampled by their own comrades, as the Carthaginian noose tightened from all sides. For hours, the butchery continued under the relentless sun until the field fell silent, littered with the dead and dying. Of the 86,000 Romans who fought, only about 14,000 managed to escape, with nearly 50,000 killed and the rest captured. Consul Paulus died fighting. Varro escaped with the cavalry. Among the dead were 80 senators and a generation of Rome's military elite, a loss so profound it seemed to spell the end of the Republic. The victory at Cannae was Hannibal's supreme masterpiece, the zenith of his military career, a triumph that immediately caused the defection of much of southern Italy, including the great city of Capua, to his cause. Yet in a fateful decision that historians have debated for millennia, Hannibal did not march on Rome itself, perhaps still lacking siege engines or believing its political collapse was now inevitable, a pause that would prove to be his greatest strategic mistake. Chapter 8: The Shadows of War, 216–11 BCE. In the catastrophic aftermath of Cannae, when all seemed lost, the Roman character revealed its deepest, most formidable strength, a stubborn, almost irrational refusal to admit defeat. The Senate, led by the steely Marcus Junius Pyrrha, who was appointed dictator, banned public mourning, refused to ransom the 8,000 Roman prisoners held by Hannibal, and raised new legions from slaves and teenagers. They rejected Hannibal's peace overtures outright and adopted a grim strategy of containment, reverting to and intensifying the Fabian approach of avoiding pitched battle at all costs. The war shifted from grand set-piece battles to a brutal, grinding struggle of sieges, skirmishes, and a fight for the loyalty of Italy's cities, a war of endurance that played to Rome's deep reserves of manpower and will. Hannibal, for all his genius, found himself pinned in southern Italy, his army too small to be everywhere, his brother Hasdrubal unable to reinforce him from Hispania, and his new Italian allies proving more a logistical burden than a military boon. The focal point became the great city of Capua, which had defected to Hannibal after Cannae, and which Rome was determined to recapture and punish as a dreadful example to others. While Hannibal was occupied in the south, another front of the war flared with brilliant, savage intensity in the wealthy, Greek-influenced city of Syracuse in Sicily. The old King Hiero II, Rome's loyal ally, had died, and his young grandson Hieronymus, swayed by Carthaginian promises, switched sides, bringing Sicily back into the vortex of the war. The Roman response was swift and terrible. The consul Marcus Claudius Marcellus, a fierce and aggressive commander, was sent with an army to besiege the fabulously fortified and wealthy city. The defense of Syracuse, however, was masterminded by one of history's greatest minds, the aged mathematician and inventor Archimedes, who designed monstrous war machines, clawed cranes to capsize ships, giant mirrors to set sails aflame. For 2 years, Marcellus's assaults were bloodily repulsed by these ingenious devices, until finally in 212 BCE, a section of the walls was taken during a festival when the guards were drunk, and the city fell to a brutal sack. During the chaos, Archimedes was killed by a Roman soldier while absorbed in a geometric diagram, his death a poignant symbol of the brute force of war overwhelming sublime intellect, and Sicily was once again secured for Rome. The noose around Hannibal's Italian strategy tightened further with the relentless Roman siege of his major ally, Capua, beginning in 212 BCE. Hannibal made a daring march to within a few miles of Rome itself in 211 BCE, Hannibal at the gates, in a desperate attempt to lift the siege by forcing the Roman armies to break off and defend their capital. The Romans, however, displayed nerves of iron. The army besieging Capua did not budge, and the city walls of Rome were manned by fresh reserves, calling Hannibal's bluff and revealing the limits of his psychological warfare. Unable to take the heavily fortified city, and with his diversion failing, Hannibal withdrew and soon after, cut off from supplies and hope, the great city of Capua surrendered to Rome. The Roman punishment was merciless. Capua's leaders were executed, its civic institutions dissolved, its land confiscated, and its people enslaved or stripped of rights, a terrifying lesson in the cost of betraying Rome. This loss was a devastating blow to Hannibal's credibility and strategy. Without a major Italian base, he was reduced to a brilliant but increasingly isolated raider, moving through the hills of Bruttium while the tide of the war began to turn elsewhere, in the land where his own family's power had been built, Hispania. Chapter 9, the scion of Scipio, 211–06 BCE. The Iberian Peninsula had become a fierce secondary theatre of the war, where Hannibal's brothers, Hasdrubal and Mago, fought to hold the Barcid kingdom against persistent Roman armies. The Roman effort there was led by 2 brothers, Gnaeus and Publius Cornelius Scipio, who campaigned with great success for years, tying down crucial Carthaginian forces that could not reinforce Hannibal. In 211 BCE, however, disaster struck. The Scipio brothers, separated and outmaneuvered by a reunited Carthaginian army reinforced by Numidian princes, were defeated and killed in separate battles within weeks of each other. Their armies were shattered, and Roman influence in Hispania was nearly extinguished, threatening to open a floodgate of men and money from the silver mines to Hannibal in Italy. In this crisis, the Roman assembly made a stunning, unconventional choice. They appointed to command in Hispania the 25-year-old son and nephew of the fallen generals, a man who bore his father's name, Publius Cornelius Scipio. This young Scipio, who would later be known as Africanus, possessed a charismatic confidence, a deep reverence for the gods, and an intuitive grasp of strategy that seemed almost divine to his men. Scipio landed in 210 BCE at the Roman foothold of Tarraco with a modest reinforcement, but instead of cautiously consolidating, he planned a breathtakingly bold stroke to shatter the Carthaginian presence. Learning that the 3 enemy armies were widely scattered, and that the great capital city of New Carthage was lightly garrisoned, he force-marched his entire army down the coast in a mere 7 days, appearing before its walls in spring 209 BCE. The city was protected by a lagoon that was believed to be impassable, but Scipio, using local knowledge gathered from fishermen, learned that it grew shallow in the afternoon with the receding tide. Launching a multi-pronged assault to fix the defenders on the main walls, he then sent a wadding party through the lagoon at low tide to scale the undefended northern section, taking the city in a single day. The capture of New Carthage was a masterstroke. yielding immense plunder, hostages from the Spanish tribes, and a vital harbour, but most importantly, it demonstrated Scipio's daring and luck, cementing his troops' loyalty. Scipio spent the next year training his army in new, more flexible tactics, and conducting shrewd diplomacy with the restless Spanish chieftains, particularly courting the princes of Numidia. The decisive battle for Hispania came in 206 BCE at Ilipa, where Scipio faced a larger army under Hasdrubal Gisco and Mago Barca, which included the formidable war elephants and cavalry of the Numidian prince Massinissa. Mimicking Hannibal's tactics at Cannae, Scipio reversed the standard deployment, placing his weaker Spanish allied infantry in the center and his veteran Roman legions on the wings. After several days of cautious feints, he launched a surprise dawn attack, had his wings advance rapidly in an oblique formation to envelop the enemy flanks while the center delayed, and used his cavalry to drive off the Numidian horse and threaten the rear. The Carthaginian army was routed, its power in Hispania broken forever. Hasdrubal Gisco and Mago fled, and the great Silvrich Peninsula, the foundation of Barcid power and wealth, fell firmly under Roman control. With Hispania secured, Scipio returned to Rome a hero, was elected consul for 205 BCE, and began advocating for his grand, inevitable strategy: to carry the war to Africa, to threaten Carthage itself, and finally force Hannibal to abandon Italy. Chapter 10: The African Gambit, 242 BCE. Despite political opposition from old guard senators like Fabius Maximus, who feared overextension, Scipio used his immense popularity to secure the province of Sicily as a base for his African invasion. He was not given a new army but permission to enroll volunteers, and he turned Sicily into a vast training ground, drilling legions in the new, more maneuverable cohort tactics he had perfected in Hispania. His most crucial diplomatic achievement was securing the full alliance of the Numidian prince Massinissa, a brilliant cavalry commander who had defected from the Carthaginians, promising him the throne of a unified Numidia in exchange for his invaluable horsemen. In 204 BCE, Scipio landed his army of approximately 35,000 men on the Cape of Beautiful promontory near Utica, establishing a fortified beachhead and beginning to raid the rich Carthaginian hinterland. The initial Carthaginian response, a combined army of their own levies and the forces of the powerful Numidian king Syphax, Massinissa's rival, was cautious, leading to a winter of tentative negotiations and a treacherous ceasefire. In a daring act of commando warfare that spring, Scipio learned the allied Carthaginian and Numidian armies were wintering in separate camps built largely of wood and reeds. He launched a night attack, sending parties to set the camps ablaze, and then slaughtering the terrified soldiers as they fled the inferno, effectively destroying the enemy force without a formal battle. This ruthless action cleared the way for an advance on Carthage's major allied city, Utica, and finally forced the Carthaginian government to recall its last, greatest hope, Hannibal Barca, who had been campaigning in Italy for 15 years. Hannibal's recall was a moment of profound melancholy and strategic defeat. He sailed from the land he had fought for so long, leaving behind a legend but no lasting victory, his grand strategy in ruins. He landed at Leptis Parva, gathered what mercenaries and veterans he could, and marched to meet Scipio, setting the stage for the final, monumental clash between the two master generals of the age, a clash that would decide the fate of the Western world. The two commanders met briefly in a famed parley before the battle, a moment of mutual respect between legends where each asserted the justice of his cause but found no path to peace. The armies met on the plain of Zama Regia in the autumn of 202 BCE. Hannibal's force was larger but heterogeneous, consisting of his veteran Italian corps, fresh Carthaginian levies, and a contingent of war elephants, while his cavalry was inferior. Scipio's army was smaller but superbly trained and cohesive, with the magnificent Numidian cavalry of Massinissa giving him a decisive advantage on the wings. As the battle commenced, Hannibal sent his 80 elephants charging, but Scipio had trained his men to open lanes in his formation, blunting their charge with blaring trumpets, and channeling them harmlessly to the rear where they caused more chaos for the Carthaginian cavalry. Massinissa and the Roman cavalry then drove their counterparts from the field and, crucially, did not pursue wildly, but returned to execute the decisive maneuver. With the cavalry gone, the infantry lines clashed. First the Carthaginian mercenaries against the Roman hastati, then the Carthaginian levies against the Roman principes, in a brutal pushing slog. Finally, Hannibal's veterans of Italy, his last and best reserve, faced Scipio's own fresh triarii and regrouped principes in a grim showdown of the most experienced troops in the Mediterranean. Just as this final, exhausted line began to engage, Massinissa and the Roman cavalry returned from their pursuit and thundered into the rear of Hannibal's veterans, replicating the Cannae envelopment but against the Carthaginians. Surrounded and with no hope of escape, Hannibal's magnificent army was systematically annihilated. He himself escaped the field on a fast horse, riding to Carthage to admit the unthinkable, total defeat. The Battle of Zama ended the Second Punic War. Carthage had no army left, and its government had no choice but to accept whatever terms the victorious Scipio, now Africanus, would impose upon them. Chapter 11, The Unforgiving Peace, 201–150 BCE. The peace treaty of 201 BCE was designed to reduce Carthage from a great empire to a harmless, tributary city-state, forever incapable of threatening Rome again. Carthage was stripped of all its overseas territories, which were given to Rome and its ally Massinissa, who now ruled a unified Numidian kingdom on Carthage's borders. It was forced to surrender its entire war fleet, save for 10 small triremes and all its war elephants, rendering it powerless at sea and on land for offensive action. A crushing indemnity of 10,000 talents of silver was to be paid over 50 years, and most humiliatingly, Carthage was forbidden from waging any war at all, even in self-defense, without Rome's express permission. Hannibal, to his credit, helped oversee the initial recovery of his broken city, reforming its corrupt oligarchic government and restoring its economy through efficient tax collection, but Roman paranoia forced him into exile a few years later. He wandered the courts of the Hellenistic East, a legendary ghost urging kings like Antiochus III to oppose Rome, before finally taking his own life in Bithynia in 183 BCE to avoid being captured and paraded in a Roman triumph. Rome emerged from the war as the unchallenged master of the Western Mediterranean, with provinces in Sicily, Sardinia, Corsica, and Hispania, and a network of loyal allies, its political and military destiny now irrevocably set on the path to empire. For 5 decades, Carthage adhered to the harsh peace, focusing entirely on commerce and becoming phenomenally wealthy once more through its fertile African hinterland and its mercantile prowess. This very prosperity, however, became a source of resentment and paranoia in Rome, particularly for a stern, moralizing senator named Marcus Porcius Cato the Elder. Cato, who visited Carthage as part of a diplomatic mission in the 150s BCE, was horrified by its bustling ports, full warehouses, and vibrant streets, seeing not a harmless trader but a resurgent rival. From that day forward, he ended every speech in the Senate, regardless of the topic, with the same grim, insistent phrase, Carthago delenda est, Carthage must be destroyed. He was opposed by more moderate voices, like Scipio Nasica, who argued that a prosperous, fearful Carthage was a useful check on the ambition of others and a reminder to Rome of the need for vigilance. The balance was tipped by the agging Carthage's nemesis, King Massinissa of Numidia, who, emboldened by the treaty, constantly raided and seized Carthaginian territory, knowing they could not legally fight back without Rome's consent. Each time Carthage appealed to Rome for arbitration, Roman commissions consistently sided with their Numidian ally, systematically stripping Carthage of its land and pushing it toward a desperate final choice: submit or fight. Chapter 12, The Final Defiance, 149 BCE. The final spark was struck in 150 BCE when Carthage, pushed beyond endurance by Massinissa's latest encroachments, finally raised an army to defend itself, a direct violation of the 201 BCE treaty. The army was raised from its own citizens, not mercenaries, and was led by generals from the democratic anti-Roman faction that had gained power through popular frustration. This citizen army, however, was no match for the battle-hardened Numidians and was decisively defeated by the 90-year-old Massinissa, leaving Carthage militarily humiliated and now politically exposed. The Roman Senate, dominated now by Cato's faction, seized on this breach as the long-awaited pretext for war, despite Carthage's immediate surrender, disarming of its forces, and execution of the anti-Roman generals in a bid for peace. A Roman army and fleet were dispatched to Africa under the consuls Manius Manilius and Lucius Marcius Censorinus, who presented Carthage with a series of escalating, impossible demands. First, they demanded 300 children of the noblest families as hostages, which the weeping Carthaginians delivered, hoping to appease the Roman wrath. With the hostages secure, the consuls then presented the ultimate, devastating demand: the city of Carthage must be abandoned. Its people could survive, but they must resettle at least 10 miles inland, away from their sacred harbors and maritime life. This demand, communicated to the gathered citizens in the Agora, triggered a burst of collective, primal rage and despair. To the Carthaginians, it was a death sentence for their civilization, their identity, and their connection to their gods and ancestors. They refused, and in that moment of refusal, the Third Punic War, a war of pure annihilation, began in earnest. The Carthaginians, with nothing left to lose, performed a miraculous transformation. They freed slaves, worked day and night forging weapons from every piece of metal available, and cut off the hair of women to make ropes for catapults. They prepared their magnificent, triple-walled city for a siege to the death, uniting in a way they never had during the wars with Hannibal, their backs against the sea and their hearts filled with a final, tragic resolve. Chapter 13, The Siege of Carthage, 149–146 BCE. The Roman consuls, expecting a quick capitulation, were shocked by the ferocity and preparation of the Carthaginian defense. Their initial assaults on the mighty walls were bloodily repulsed with heavy losses. The war settled into a grueling 2-year blockade and siege, marked by Roman incompetence, disease in the camps, and changing commanders, as the desperate Carthaginians launched daring raids and even managed to build a new fleet of 50 ships in a hidden inland harbor. The man who finally brought ruthless efficiency to the Roman effort was the newly elected consul for 147 BCE, Publius Cornelius Scipio Aemilianus, the adoptive grandson of Scipio Africanus, a man of stern discipline and natural military talent. Scipio restored order to the demoralized Roman army, tightened the blockade until famine stalked the city's streets, and systematically captured the outlying districts, pushing the defenders back toward the ancient citadel, the Baissa. In the spring of 146 BCE, after weeks of brutal street-by-street fighting, the Romans broke into the city proper, and the battle became a nightmare of urban combat, with the legions having to clear and demolish every house and tower. The final resistance centered on the steep, fortified hill of the Baissa, where the last Carthaginian warriors and citizens made their stand, fighting from the rooftops of the temples and the narrow, winding alleys. Scipio ordered the entire area to be systematically burned and leveled, section by section, to eliminate hiding places and traps, creating a wasteland of smoke, rubble, and death as he advanced. After 6 days of this final slaughter, the last 50,000 survivors, starving and hopeless, surrendered from the citadel, leaving only 900 Roman deserters and the general Hasdrubal, not the brother of Hannibal, with his family in the temple of Eshmun. Hasdrubal, who had led the defense, then abandoned his followers and surrendered abjectly to Scipio, begging for mercy, while his wife, cursing his cowardice, threw herself and her children into the temple flames. With this final act of defiance, the last fire of Carthaginian spirit was extinguished. The great city, which had stood for 700 years, was now utterly conquered. Its streets silent but for the cries of the enslaved and the crackle of the fires. Chapter 14, The Ashes and the Salt, 146 BCE. Following Roman tradition and the specific decree of the Senate, Scipio Aemilianus gave the order for the systematic destruction of the city of Carthage. The surviving population, perhaps 50,000 people out of a pre-war population of several 100,000, were sold into slavery, their lives and lineages scattered to the winds of the empire. For 10 days, Roman soldiers methodically plundered the city of every artifact of gold, silver, and art, before setting the remaining structures ablaze in a final, all-consuming conflagration. The great walls and fortifications were torn down stone by stone, the magnificent harbors were rendered useless, and the land of the city itself was formally cursed by Roman priests to ensure it would never rise again. The legend that the earth was sown with salt is a later, powerful metaphor. The real curse was a religious one, and the territory was declared Age Publicus, public land, forbidden for settlement. Scipio, watching the flames consume the city for days, is said to have wept, quoting Homer's lines about the future fall of Troy, foreseeing that a similar fate might one day befall his own Rome. Carthage's vast hinterland became the new Roman province of Africa, a fertile granary that would one day feed the city of Rome, its former enemy, now its master and consumer. The destruction of Carthage in 146 BCE was not an isolated event. In that same year, the Roman army under Lucius Mummius brutally sacked the ancient Greek city of Corinth, another commercial rival, as a display of overwhelming force. These twin destructions sent a thunderous, unequivocal message across the Mediterranean world. Rome was now the unchallenged superpower, tolerating no rivalry, and the age of independent Hellenistic and Phoenician city-states was definitively over. The Punic Wars, which had begun with a minor quarrel over mercenaries in Sicily 118 years earlier, had culminated in the utter annihilation of one of the ancient world's greatest civilizations. The conflict had forged the Roman Republic into a hardened imperial machine, with a professional army, a complex provincial administration, and a taste for absolute dominance that would shape its politics for the next century. The ghost of Hannibal and the fear of Carthage, however, would linger in the Roman psyche for centuries, a haunting lesson in the dangers of a rival that would be invoked in politics and literature long after the last stone of the city had been carried away. Chapter 15, Echoes in the Roman Sea. As the smoke over Carthage drifted out to sea and faded into the endless blue of the Mediterranean, a profound and lasting silence fell where once there had been the clamor of merchants, the prayers of priests, and the debates of senators. The 3 Punic Wars had been more than a series of military conflicts. They were a great, painful forge that hammered the Roman Republic into a new shape, transforming it from an Italian power into a Mediterranean empire. The need to confront Hannibal had revolutionized Roman warfare, leading to the professional manipular army that would go on to conquer the Hellenistic East, while the need to administer Sicily and Hispania created the template for provincial government. The vast wealth in plunder and slaves that flowed into Rome created drastic social inequalities, empowering a new class of ultra-rich equestrians and landowning senators, while displacing the small farmers who were the backbone of the legions. This social tension, born from the victories over Carthage, would eventually erupt in the bloody civil wars of the Gracchi, Marius, Sulla, and Caesar, leading to the Republic's own downfall a century later. The memory of Hannibal Barca, the great adversary, never faded. He became the ultimate symbol of cunning and daring for Romans, a benchmark against which all future generals and threats were measured, his name invoked to instill both fear and a strange sense of nostalgic respect. The phrase Hannibal ad portas, Hannibal is at the gates, became a proverbial saying for imminent, existential danger, a testament to the deep, generational trauma his campaigns had inflicted on the Roman soul. For Carthage, there was no such legacy. Its libraries were burned, its history written by its enemies, its gods forgotten, and its very existence reduced for centuries to a cautionary tale of pride and destruction. Yet, in a final twist of history, a new Roman Carthage would be founded on the same site by Julius Caesar a century later, becoming one of the greatest cities of the Roman Empire, its harbours once again full of grain ships bound for the mouth of the Tiber. So ends our long recounting of the Punic Wars, a saga of towering ambition, desperate courage, and the relentless tides of fate that washed over empires and swept them into the silent depths of history. Let these echoes now fade gently, leaving you with nothing but the quiet peace of the present moment and the deep, restorative calm of a story fully told. And so, as the final echoes of clashing swords and crashing rams fade across the centuries, we leave the Mediterranean world forever altered by this epic struggle. The Punic Wars carved the course of Western history, forging Rome's imperial destiny while etching the legend of Hannibal and the tragedy of Carthage into our collective memory. It was a saga of human brilliance and frailty, of staggering resilience and profound loss, reminding us that the currents of fate are shaped by ambition, chance, and an unwavering will to endure. From this distant shore of history, we now return to the quiet of the present. Thank you for listening to the Cathedral of Ancient Light. May the lessons of the past bring you peace, and may you now drift into a deep and restful sleep. Good night.